The gavel slammed down, but the loudest sound in the courtroom was the cooing of twin babies. A billionaire's mistress sat smirking, waiting to inherit an empire, completely unaware that the widow rocking her infants held a piece of paper that was about to destroy her entire life. Keep watching. The air inside Cook County Probate Courtroom 1204 was stifling, thick with the smell of lemon wood polish, expensive cologne, and the palpable electricity of high-stakes greed. Outside, a late Chicago winter whipped sleet against the towering windows, but inside, the temperature was rising by the second. In the front row of the gallery sat the board members of Sterling Vanguard Holdings, a commercial real estate empire worth north of $2 billion. They were silent, eagle-eyed men and women, waiting to see who would hold the reins of the empire after the sudden, shocking death of their founder, Richard William Sterling. Richard had been a titan of the industry, a man whose ambition was matched only by his fatal flaws. At 58, a massive coronary aneurysm had dropped him dead in the foyer of a luxury Gold Coast penthouse. But it wasn't his death that had the city's elite buzzing. It was the penthouse he died in, and the woman he shared it with. That woman, Vanessa Kensington, sat at the petitioner's table. At 28, Vanessa was a former public relations executive who had seamlessly transitioned into the role of billionaire's muse. She was dressed for the occasion in a custom black Dior suit that somehow managed to look both mournful and aggressively triumphant. A wide-brimmed hat cast a dramatic shadow over her flawlessly contoured face. Beside her sat David Ross, a notoriously ruthless probate litigator whose hourly rate could finance a small country. Vanessa leaned over, whispering something into Ross's ear. He chuckled softly, patting her hand. Vanessa had every reason to be confident. 7 months ago, in a scandal that fed the tabloids for weeks, Richard had publicly left his wife of 15 years. He hadn't just left her. He had moved Vanessa into his primary properties, placed her on the board of his charitable foundation, and paraded her at every high society gala, from Manhattan to Monaco. He had made it abundantly clear to anyone who would listen that Vanessa was his future. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a muffled thud. The low hum of whispers instantly died. Every head in the gallery turned. Claire Sterling walked down the center aisle. She wore a simple, unbranded charcoal dress, a modest black wool coat, and flat shoes. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a severe clasp, her face devoid of makeup, revealing the deep, bruised exhaustion of a woman who had spent the last year in hell. But it wasn't Claire's austere appearance that caused the gallery to hold its collective breath. It was what she was pushing. A large, double stroller glided smoothly over the carpet. Inside were Leo and Lily, 6-month-old fraternal twins. They were bundled in soft, cream-colored blankets, oblivious to the fact that their financial destinies were about to be fought over in a court of law. Claire's presence was a physical manifestation of Richard's deepest betrayal. When Richard had walked out of their home 7 months ago to move in with Vanessa, Claire was 8 months pregnant with the children they had spent half a decade and hundreds of thousands of dollars in IVF treatments trying to conceive. He had abandoned her at the finish line of their most difficult journey. Vanessa's lips curled into a barely concealed sneer as Claire parked the stroller next to the respondent's table. A desperate sympathy play, Vanessa thought, rolling her eyes. She leaned over to her lawyer again. Look at her, dragging those brats in here to make the judge feel sorry for her. It won't change the ink on the paper. Let her have her dramatics, Vanessa, David Ross murmured, casually adjusting his silk tie. The law is the law. The august trust is ironclad. Sitting completely alone at the respondent's table, awaiting Claire, was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a 65-year-old attorney with a shock of white hair and a reputation for being the most unflappable legal mind in Illinois. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was the Sterling family attorney. He had incorporated Richard's very first LLC 20 years ago, back when Richard and Claire were living in a cramped apartment in Evanston, eating ramen noodles and drafting business proposals on a folding table. Arthur stood up, offering Claire a warm, deeply respectful nod. He didn't offer his condolences, he had already spent hours doing that in private, but he reached out and gently touched the rim of the stroller. Baby Lily cooed, reaching a tiny, chubby hand toward the lawyer's gold cufflinks. "Are you ready for this, Claire?" Arthur asked, his voice a gravelly whisper meant only for her. Claire looked across the aisle, her eyes locked onto Vanessa. For a fraction of a second, the deep exhaustion in Claire's eyes parted, revealing a glint of something cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "I've been ready since the day he left, Arthur," Claire replied, taking her seat. She didn't look at Vanessa again. She reached into the stroller, gently resting one hand on Leo's chest and the other on Lily's. "All rise," the bailiff boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The Honourable Judge Peter Gallagher presiding. Judge Gallagher, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, took his seat. He peered over his reading glasses, taking in the scene. He noted the high-priced legal muscle on Vanessa's side, the stoic solitude of Claire, and the silent board members waiting like vultures in the gallery. "Be seated," Judge Gallagher commanded. He opened the thick manila file in front of him. "We are here today for the preliminary probate hearing regarding the estate of Richard William Sterling. I understand there is some contention regarding the primary beneficiary status and the execution of Mr. Sterling's final wishes." David Ross stood up instantly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, there is no contention from our side. My client, Miss Vanessa Kensington, is the executor and primary beneficiary of the Sterling Revocable Trust, as amended and fully executed on August 14th of last year. We are simply here to ask the court to validate the document so my client can begin managing the estate and stabilizing Vanguard Holdings. The market is watching, Your Honor. Delays will cost the company millions." Judge Gallagher looked over at Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, you have been the custodian of Mr. Sterling's legal affairs for 2 decades. Opposing counsel has submitted a document dated August 14th. Do you have the original?" Arthur stood up slowly. He didn't have a team of paralegals behind him. He didn't have a stack of banker's boxes. He just had one worn leather briefcase resting on the table. "I do, Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I have the August 14th document right here." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. A triumphant smirk finally broke through her carefully constructed mask of mourning. She looked directly at Claire, wanting, needing, to see the devastated widow break down. But Claire didn't look back. She just pulled a pacifier from her pocket and gently placed it into baby Leo's mouth. Arthur snapped open the brass locks of his leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. He withdrew a thick, cream-colored document bound in a navy blue legal cover. "With the court's permission, I will read the primary disbursements of the August 14th will, as requested by Mr. Ross," Arthur stated, stepping up to the podium. "Proceed." Judge Gallagher nodded, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. Arthur adjusted his reading glasses. He cleared his throat, his tone flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "I, Richard William Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils. I leave the entirety of my controlling shares in Sterling Vanguard Holdings, the primary residence located in the Gold Coast district of Chicago, the secondary property in Aspen, Colorado, and the entirety of my liquid asset portfolio, currently valued at approximately $85 million, to my partner, Vanessa Kensington. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The board members exchanged wide-eyed, frantic looks. It was one thing to hear the rumors. It was another to hear a multi-billion-dollar empire handed over to a 28-year-old former PR rep in open court. Vanessa's smile widened. She couldn't help it. She let out a small, breathless sigh, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. She had won. The sleepless nights dealing with Richard's demanding temper, the endless public scrutiny, the social media hate, it had all been worth it. She was now one of the wealthiest women in North America. And for the surviving spouse? Judge Gallagher asked, his brow furrowed. He glanced at Claire, who was currently wiping a bit of spit-up from baby Lily's chin with a burp cloth, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just been legally stripped of her life's work. Arthur turned the page. To my estranged wife, Claire Sterling, I leave the sum of $2 million, the title to our former residence in Evanston, Illinois, and the standard state-mandated child support for any biological children resulting from our marriage. David Ross stood up, resting his hands on the petitioner's table. Your Honor, the document is clear, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized. Mr. Sterling's intentions were explicitly documented. He had moved on from his previous marriage. He wished to build a new life and a new legacy with Ms. Kensington. We respectfully request that the court stamp this will valid and grant Ms. Kensington immediate executorship. Vanessa turned her head, finally catching Claire's eye. She offered Claire a look of deep, patronizing pity. It was a look that said, "You can take your $2 million and your crying babies back to the suburbs. The adults are running the city now." Claire met Vanessa's gaze. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Claire smiled. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was a small, knowing, almost pitying smile. Vanessa frowned, a sudden, inexplicable chill running down her spine. Why was the widow smiling? "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Gallagher said, cutting through the heavy silence. "Do you have any objections to the validation of this document? Does the respondent wish to contest the August 14th will on the grounds of mental capacity or undue influence?" "No, Your Honor," Arthur said smoothly. David Ross looked surprised. He had come armed with medical records proving Richard's mental acuity and witnesses ready to testify that Richard made the changes willingly. A lack of contest meant this was over. It was a total, unmitigated victory. "Excellent," Ross said swiftly, opening his own folder to pull out the executorship transfer forms. "If counsel has no objections, we can conclude this." "I have no objections to the document," Arthur interrupted, his voice raising just enough to command the room. He slowly closed the cream-colored folder containing the August 14th will. He placed it off to the side of the podium, dismissing it entirely. Because contesting it would be a profound waste of the court's time, Ross paused, his pen hovering over his paperwork. "Excuse me?" Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out a thick stack of papers. Instead, he withdrew a single, slim, red folder. "Your Honor, I read the August 14th document purely to satisfy Mr. Ross's request and to establish a timeline for the court," Arthur explained, his eyes locking on to Vanessa. "However, that document is entirely null and void." "Objection!" Ross barked, standing up straight. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Pendleton just stated he doesn't contest the will." "I don't contest the existence of the August will, David," Arthur replied, his tone shifting from formal to dangerously conversational. I am simply stating a legal fact. It is no longer the final testament of Richard Sterling." Vanessa stood up, her composure cracking. "What are you talking about? Richard told me that was his final will. He promised me." "Order!" Judge Gallagher snapped, banging his gavel once. "Miss Kensington, sit down and let your counsel speak. Mr. Pendleton, you better explain yourself. And quickly." "Gladly, Your Honor," Arthur said. He opened the red folder. As the court is well aware, a last will and testament is only valid until a newer one is executed. I hold in my hand the true, final, and binding last will and testament of Richard Sterling. It was drafted by my office, signed by Mr. Sterling, witnessed by a notary and a chief of staff at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and executed on February 12th, 2026. A deathly silence fell over the room. Vanessa's perfectly tanned face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen grey. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned white. "February 12th, David Ross whispered, rapidly doing the math in his head. That was exactly 48 hours before he died." "Correct, Mr. Ross," Arthur said, turning to face Vanessa directly. 48 hours before his fatal aneurysm. "And I believe, Miss Kensington, that was precisely the weekend you decided to take a girls' trip to Miami, leaving Mr. Sterling alone in Chicago complaining of chest pains." Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. "Your Honor," Ross stammered, frantically trying to regain control. "We had no knowledge of this document. We demand to see it immediately. My client was his primary partner." "This final document," Arthur continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "completely revokes the August 14th trust. But more importantly, Your Honor, it contains a biological stipulation regarding the true ownership of Vanguard Holdings. A stipulation that Ms. Kensington is entirely unaware of, and one that changes the ownership of a $2 billion empire as of right now." Arthur turned his gaze back to Claire. Claire quietly reached down and picked up baby Leo, holding him to her shoulder. The baby boy blinked sleepily at the massive courtroom. "Shall I read the final terms, Your Honor?" Arthur asked. Judge Gallagher leaned forward, completely engrossed. "Read it, Mr. Pendleton. Every word." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Outside, the Chicago sleet battered the high, arched windows of the Cook County Courthouse, but inside, the temperature felt like it had plummeted to absolute zero. Arthur Pendleton adjusted his reading glasses, his hand steady as he held the final testament of Richard William Sterling. He looked over the rim of his glasses, his eyes sweeping past the petrified mistress, past the bewildered high-priced litigator, and settling on the judge. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his voice resonant and commanding. "Section 4, Paragraph A of the February 12th will read as follows. I, Richard William Sterling, do hereby acknowledge that my actions over the preceding 12 months have been a catastrophic failure of judgment, morality, and fiduciary responsibility. I explicitly and entirely revoke the Vanguard Revocable Trust dated August 14th, having discovered that my signature on that document was obtained under sustained, calculated, and fraudulent manipulation." "Fraudulent manipulation?" Vanessa shrieked, slamming her palms on the mahogany table. Her Dior hat slipped back on her head, ruining her carefully curated image of the mourning widow. "That's a lie. He loved me. We were going to be married in St. Bart's this spring. David, do something." "Quiet, Vanessa," David Ross hissed, his face flushed with professional embarrassment. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, we vehemently object to the characterization. You are objecting to the words of a dead man, Mr. Ross." Judge Gallagher interrupted, his gavel hovering over the sounding block. "You may save your objections for your appeals. Sit down, control your client, or I will have the bailiff remove her." "Proceed, Mr. Pendleton." Arthur nodded, turning the page. The document continues. "I hereby direct the entirety of my estate, including my 82% controlling stake in Sterling Vanguard Holdings, all liquid assets currently held at Northern Trust Corporation, and all real property, including the Gold Coast penthouse and the Aspen estate, into the newly formed Sterling Biological Heritage Trust." In the gallery, Thomas Wright, a former Goldman Sachs partner and the lead independent director of Vanguard's board, leaned forward so fast his chair squeaked. The corporate implications of those words were staggering. $2 billion in commercial real estate assets were being moved in a single breath. "Section 5 details the terms of this trust," Arthur read, his voice taking on a surgical precision. "The sole, irrevocable beneficiaries of this trust are my biological offspring, Leo William Sterling and Lily Grace Sterling. Furthermore, recognizing her unwavering competence, moral fortitude, and deep understanding of Vanguard's corporate structure, I appoint my legal wife, Claire Sterling, as the sole executor of my estate, the sole trustee of the Heritage Trust, and the interim chief executive officer of Sterling Vanguard Holdings." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. The board members looked at each other in sheer disbelief, followed almost instantly by profound relief. Claire Sterling was a known entity. She had helped build Vanguard from the ground up 15 years ago, before stepping back to endure grueling IVF treatments. The markets would stabilize immediately with her at the helm, rather than a 28-year-old PR girl with a penchant for posting yacht photos on Instagram. Vanessa's chest heaved. The color had completely vanished from her face. She looked at David Ross, her eyes wide with a feral, cornered panic. "He can't do that. He can't just leave me with nothing. The penthouse is mine. My clothes are there. My jewelry." David Ross ignored her, his legal mind racing to find a loophole. He stood up, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, we contest this document on the grounds of diminished capacity. Mr. Sterling signed this a mere 48 hours before suffering a massive aneurysm. Furthermore, if the estate is restricted entirely to biological heirs, then my client has a legal claim to file an injunction against the probate." Judge Gallagher frowned. "On what grounds, Mr. Ross?" Vanessa stood up, tears of desperate rage streaming down her face. "Because I'm pregnant!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I am 12 weeks pregnant with Richard's child. That means my baby is a biological heir, and under Illinois law, I am entitled to executorship and a share of that trust." The courtroom erupted. The reporters sitting in the back row began furiously typing on their phones. Claire didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, holding baby Leo against her shoulder, gently patting his back. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly sad, but not for herself. David Ross looked at Vanessa, surprised but instantly opportunistic. "Your Honor, you heard my client. If she is carrying Mr. Sterling's biological child, the terms of the Heritage Trust extend to her unborn baby. We demand a stay of execution on the transfer of all Vanguard assets until a paternity test can be conducted at birth." Judge Gallagher looked at Arthur Pendleton. "Mr. Pendleton, this complicates matters significantly." Arthur didn't look surprised. In fact, for the first time that morning, the seasoned attorney smiled. It was a cold, devastating smile. He reached back into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "It doesn't complicate matters at all, Your Honor," Arthur said quietly. "In fact, Ms. Kensington's miraculous." Pregnancy is the precise reason this February 12th will exists." Arthur unclasped the envelope and withdrew a stack of medical records authenticated with the blue seal of the state of Illinois. "Your Honor," Arthur began, pacing slowly in front of the judge's bench. In early January, Miss Kensington informed Mr. Sterling that she was expecting a child. She used this news to pressure him into finalizing a marriage date and to demand an immediate cash transfer of $10 million into a private offshore account, supposedly to set up a nest egg for their new family. Vanessa's hands began to shake violently. "Stop it. Stop lying about us." "But Richard was a man who appreciated data," Arthur continued, ignoring her. "And he possessed a piece of medical data that he had never shared with Miss Kensington. A piece of data that immediately proved she was lying and subsequently prompted him to hire Kroll Inc., a private corporate intelligence firm, to investigate her." David Ross crossed his arms. "What data, Arthur? Get to the point." Arthur turned to face the opposing table directly. 3 years ago, during his marriage to Claire, after their final, successful round of egg retrieval and embryo fertilization at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Richard Sterling made a private medical decision. Exhausted by the medical interventions and content with the frozen embryos they had secured, Richard flew to a private clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. Arthur handed the top document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "He underwent a permanent, elective vasectomy," Arthur stated, his words falling like anvils in the quiet room. "Confirmed by post-operative seminal analysis to be 100% successful. Richard Sterling was completely sterile for the entirety of his relationship with Vanessa Kensington." The silence that followed was so profound, you could hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the courtroom wall. Judge Gallagher adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the medical documents. His face darkened into a scowl of pure, judicial fury. He looked down at the petitioner's table. "Miss Kensington," the judge rumbled, his voice dripping with disdain, "is there something you would like to clarify regarding the paternity of the child you just swore, under penalty of perjury, in my courtroom, belongs to the deceased?" Vanessa was paralyzed. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The luxurious Dior suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. The reality of her situation crashed down on her all at once. The $2 billion empire, the private jets, the Aspen ski trips, the endless credit cards. It was all gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that she had just committed perjury in open court. I, she stammered, tears ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks. She turned to her lawyer, grabbing his sleeve. "David, please. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. You have to fix this." David Ross calmly reached over and physically detached her fingers from his suit jacket. He didn't look at her. His reputation was his currency in Chicago, and he had just been unwittingly used to peddle a massive fraud to a sitting judge. Ross stood up, gathering his expensive Montblanc pen and his legal pads. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clipped and totally devoid of its former swagger. "In light of this newly presented evidence, I find myself in an irreconcilable conflict of interest. I must formally withdraw as counsel for Miss Kensington, effective immediately." "You can't leave me!" Vanessa screamed, completely losing her composure. "You took a retainer. You promised me we'd win." "I took a retainer to probate a legitimate will, Vanessa," Ross said coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. "Not to aid and abet extortion. Good luck." He turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him. Judge Gallagher banged his gavel. "Order! Miss Kensington, you are currently without counsel. I strongly advise you to remain silent to avoid further self-incrimination." The court will be forwarding the transcript of today's hearing to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office to determine if perjury or criminal fraud charges are warranted. Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing pitifully in the large room. The judge turned his attention back to the respondent's table. His expression softened infinitesimally. Mr. Pendleton, the court finds the February 12th will valid, binding, and fully executable. I am officially tossing out the August 14th document. The estate of Richard Sterling, including all voting shares of Vanguard Holdings, is hereby transferred into the Sterling Biological Heritage Trust. Thank you, Your Honor, Arthur said, bowing his head slightly. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Gallagher said, looking directly at Claire. Claire stood up. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a general who had just won a brutal, bloody war, bearing the invisible scars of betrayal, but standing tall regardless. I am incredibly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sterling, the judge said quietly. And I am sorry for the indignities you have had to endure in this room today. As the sole executor and trustee, the empire your husband built is now entirely in your hands. I wish you the best of luck. Thank you, Your Honor, Claire replied, her voice steady, clear, and perfectly modulated. Court is adjourned, the bailiff announced. As the gallery began to empty, the board members of Vanguard Holdings didn't leave. They formed a quiet, respectful line near the aisle. Thomas Wright stepped forward as Claire approached, pushing the double stroller. Claire, Thomas said, offering his hand. We are profoundly relieved. The board is fully behind you. When you're ready, we have a crisis management team waiting at the JLL Tower to help you transition into the CEO role and stabilize the stock. Claire shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Thomas. Tell the board we will convene on Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. We have a lot of mess to clean up, and Vanguard is going back to its original mandate. No more vanity projects. Understood, boss. Thomas smiled, visibly relaxing. Claire continued down the aisle, stopping just parallel to the petitioner's table. Vanessa was still sitting there, a crumpled, sobbing mess of ruined mascara and shattered dreams. Claire looked down at the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. She felt no rage anymore, only a cold, clinical indifference. Vanessa, Claire said softly. Vanessa looked up, her eyes red and puffy, filled with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. My security team is currently at the Gold Coast penthouse, Claire said, her tone businesslike. They are boxing up your personal belongings. You have until 5 p.m. to collect them from the lobby. If you attempt to enter the premises or any other property owned by Vanguard Holdings, you will be arrested for trespassing. You took everything from me, Vanessa whispered, her voice shaking. No, Claire corrected her, adjusting baby Lily's blanket. You tried to steal a life that wasn't yours. I'm just taking out the trash. Claire didn't wait for a response. She turned away from the weeping mistress, walking through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. As she stepped out into the grand hallway of the courthouse, the Chicago sun finally broke through the winter clouds, streaming through the skylights and illuminating the faces of her sleeping twins. The empire was hers, but more importantly, her family was safe. If you enjoyed this courtroom drama and love seeing karma served on a silver platter, please smash that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling real-life stories and jaw-dropping legal battles. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Claire's ultimate revenge.